Hello, everyone. Welcome to Making the Rounds. You may think I haven't said that for some time now, but that is wrong. We did record an episode right before Worlds, however, we didn't release it. I'm not going to say why. Emily may say why at a future date, but for now, we're not going to say why. And so we didn't this year have the opportunity to do Making the Rounds as consistently throughout international events as we have in the past. However, what I will give you now is the new improved Making the Rounds, where both of us are trying to beat each other because Emily dyed her hair color darker, and I, for some reason, have Emily's glasses. So that's what we're going with.
And people already confuse us, and now we're just like fusing.
Now it's just perfect. Yeah. So we just decided to take the community opinion and allow it to kind of homogenize how we do and how we control our actions, kind of like certain esports organizations. However, so the format for this episode is a year in review, and then towards the end of it, we are going to discuss a little bit of the future for Emily Rand, perhaps do a reflection on her career because she just won a very prestigious Esports Journalist of the Year award. I am in the presence of royalty. Esports Journalist of the Year award, Esports Journalist of the World in the English language. However you want to phrase it or go with it. So, yeah, we'll do a quick year in the review, kind of a scuffed version of it. We're not going to have a lot of very specific awards that we want to talk about, but we will talk about things that were memorable to us or stood out when we were thinking about League of Legends this year. So let's start with a very common one, which is just what was your favorite game to watch this year? Not necessarily the best. Everyone loves the quality of the Demon Gaming series or some of the weird stuff that Suning did. But just in general, what your favorite game to watch was. Let's just see how much of a pleb you really are. Let's go.
Yeah, so definitely this is not the best game of League of Legends at this point. It was actually arguably one of the worst games in this series, I think. But the final game between Top Esports and JD Gaming in their spring finals, because these teams also face each other in summer finals, this is where JDG ended up taking it. This is also where TES is. So for people that don't know, TES are kind of known for sometimes running it down in draft. And this draft specifically, they set it up so that they could do a swap and send Knight top and put 369 in mid lane because of the matchup, and Knight looked really uncomfortable in top lane, and it was unfortunate. That's not the reason why I picked this, though. I picked this because I think you can see an outline of what TES would later become in summer, because at this point JackeyLove had not been playing with the team that long because he was kind of stuck due to some interesting contract disputes, let's just say. If you haven't gone through what happened there, actually Peter Dunn and I did a video about it that's probably still on ESPN's YouTube channel. If it hasn't been taken off, I don't think it has yet. Yeah, that reminds me, I need to download some of those YouTube videos. But yeah, we talk about it in length in terms of what happened there, but basically there was a lot of nonsense that went on with JackeyLove trying to find a team that involved his cousin stepping in as his agent, and it was really bad, and people threw shade at each other. And, good old LPL drama, honestly. If you follow LPL, you won't be surprised whatsoever. So this is kind of the prototype of what this TES team would become, despite the fact that I already mentioned the lane swap did not go as well as they expected. This is also the game where Lumao really popped off on his signature champion of Bard. Zoom is also on what I think is his best champion in Ornn. And it's just a really interesting look at this JDG team that I don't think you'd look at them and say, like, this is pound for pound the best players in every single position. Even as good of a season as Kanavi had in spring, I would have rated some other junglers higher than him, to be quite honest. I know that's kind of a controversial take as well. But to see the way this team kind of overcome some of the weaknesses that they automatically have and drafts around that pretty well and plays around that pretty well and allows there are players like Lu Mao, who I think is really smart just about the game in general, but also really, really strong on certain champions that may not necessarily be what people would consider meta picks. I thought JDG did a pretty good job of recognizing that, and this game kind of encapsulates everything that I like about this JDG team. And watching them win spring finals was really cool. So yeah, that is my pick.
Everyone who knows me is probably going to expect me to pick an LPL game or a game where G2 beats a Korean team, something along those lines. However, since I did spend a lot of time this year focused on Academy and playing and coaching 100 Thieves Academy, I'll just talk about my favorite games from there. It's hard for me to choose a bit because I had so many roster iterations, but I think both of them are probably from summer. Probably the most memorable game for me was we were playing Ziggs bot and practicing Ziggs bot for ages into Aphelios, and every draft, Prismal just wanted them to pick Aphelios. And then we were able to debut the Ziggs bot, and I think that game really illustrated a lot of, against CLG Academy, really illustrated a lot of things that we had been working on. Saligo got to play LeBlanc, which was a champion that he always wanted to pick, was always willing to play, but he had to really work on his LeBlanc. I remember that, Aaron always pops off, honestly, low-key. Like, we don't give him any resources, and he carries the game from Survive side, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in the second game. Contracts played his signature Graves, and the combination of Ziggs, Graves ult, and Bard ulti was really disgusting in general, so that's just a really fun game for me, and that was right before Poom and Contracts got moved up to LCS, so it was really fun to watch. And then the other one was our second regular season game against EGA, where I think Fake God got like 9 kills or something on Mordekaiser. And then in comms, he was just talking about he was like really, really dominant. Like, this guy is not naturally the most extroverted guy, but he was talking about how, just give the game to me. I won't say his exact phrasing. It was a really cool game from him. Their comp didn't really have a good answer to Mordekaiser. It was a game with like the second roster with Breezy and Kenvi. I also think it was one of Breezy's better games too, the entire season. So really glad that I was able to kind of watch them win both of those games, and it was pretty satisfying to watch. Yeah, in terms of actual just like for fun games, a lot of the V5 games from spring were just really cool. If you want to revisit just some really whack LPL stuff.
If you want to see one man be forced into playing every single position.
It's very similar to SFM, right? Because SFM played every single role.
Yeah.
It's like, were there other just kind of fun games you'd recommend people to go back that they may not have seen?
It was a Sooning game, and it was in their, let me look back at the stats. It was in their summer, run. And that's when I first, because I was like dunking on Sooning the entire time, right? I was like, this team is not going to, I don't have a lot of confidence in this team because even though they've come a long way, I think they have like really, really glaring and obvious weaknesses where they're not going to be able to overcome. I think it was the V5 series actually. Yeah. It was the V5 series. That entire series, I forget what specific game. I'm like skimming through the... Oh yeah, this was also the game where they randomly, V5 decided to put Bew on Lucian and let him carry, and it actually worked. I was also surprised that happened.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah, I think, and then, so there was like the Sword Art Morgana game that was really, really good. This is also where we really saw everyone's obsession with Jhin, because that was like one of the most hotly contested things in this. Another memorable play, so like piggybacking on that, I would say this series was really interesting to me because it showcased a Sooning that was a lot better than what I'd seen from them in the regular season, and by that I mean it showed to me that despite the fact that, again, like I have a really soft spot in my heart for teams with really glaring weaknesses, actually, because that's always interesting to me in terms of like how they cover that up, right? And how you can have a hyper focused play style and it actually can work out. And so this series kind of pointed out to me that like, oh, okay, yeah, they still have a lot of the same weaknesses, but they're being a lot smarter about how they approach covering it up and also using some of those as a strength, i.e. SOFM's pathing, just generally. And then piggybacking on that, I think this has already been talked about like a fuck ton, but the series where Bin ended up playing the Jax into Renekton at Worlds and against TES, and he just like you basically have to be like crazy stupid aggressive in order to overcome that initially, and Bin is that. And like I had the pleasure of talking to him at this year's Worlds, and one of the things that really struck me, which you kind of going in, this about LPL players because of the way they play, because it's always there on the Rift, right? Like the way that they play reflects the idea that they have the utmost confidence in their mechanics. But I remember interviewing Bin after their win over G2 on like the final day of their group. And he was like, I was like, oh yeah, so, you played this is a really risky choice to, not take flash or like not take, was it not take flash or not take teleport? I forget. Oh my God. Everything's blending together. Anyway, the like weird Omnistone Camille game he had, I was like, okay, like this is a risky choice, right? And he was just like, no, it wasn't. Like the undercurrent of him, like he was like, well, my team has confidence in me and I have confidence in me. So like, why wouldn't we play it? Like he didn't come out and say it like that, but that is basically the interview is like, well, I have confidence in my play. I know I can do this, like I know I can beat these people. And you see it every day in LPL players in the way that they play. But to have that like confirmed so succinctly and so just like straightforwardly, like why wouldn't I have confidence in my mechanics? Why wouldn't my team have confidence in my mechanics after having seen me play? And it's not even like an arrogance thing. It's just like a very like factual, like this is how it is. And I think you really also saw that in that game against 369, where he basically just has to go stupid aggressive on Jax from the get-go, and he does, and it ends up working out incredibly well in his favor. And that's another thing that could have gone like horrifically wrong for them. But because he just has this like insane belief in his own hands, it worked out. And I don't know, there's something really like weirdly charming about that to me, honestly. Maybe that's why I ended up liking the LPL so much.
Okay, let's move on to most memorable player. So I feel like if we say best player of the year, maybe there's a nuanced conversation there. Or actually, probably there is, honestly. I think that demonstrably, people will probably focus a lot on Worlds and Summer and how that went and just flat out say Kenyan or Nuguri or something like that. Mm-hmm. That in itself is an interesting conversation because I think it's clearly Kenyan. Not the solo winners. But in terms of just, so we can say like our vote for player of the year or player of the season, and then also kind of our most memorable player, right? So I would say that Kenyan is still a really, really easy one because of how the jungle meta changed in Summer, and he's always just performed very well. His pathing's always been really on point. Last year at Worlds, I was thinking, okay, well, Nuguri isn't even the best player on this team. Like, why are people hyping him? And I also remember thinking he was better than Tarzan at the time, right? So I think Kenyan's a really good jungler. He's an easy vote for MVP of the season for me. Generally speaking, overall, I feel like Knight also deserves a nod, just because I think he had an insane performance the entire season, and so does his team. So That's where I'm coming from.
So Canyon was actually going to be mine of the year, and it's not for his summer performance, but it was actually because of his spring performance. Because I think, like, everyone was looking at that Damwon team, and they were like, oh, okay, Damwon lost something between Worlds and now they're terrible, and whatever. And we didn't really get to see glimpses of the team that they would become until actually arguably at MSC when they attended. Despite the fact that you see a lot of players struggling with the ping, to be honest, which is why when people tell me that NA ping doesn't matter, I'm just like, well, I watched an entire like thing where teams were taking it seriously on 30 ping, and you can actually see them visibly struggling. That was, again, I guess I just really like showings where you can see a team not at their best, but kind of the blueprint of what they're going to become later down the road. But I actually thought Canyon's performance in spring was like really good, and I was surprised at how many people were kind of skewering him for it and saying that he was already washed. I thought he really kept that team like up in terms of being not like at the bottom of the table based on how they were playing. I don't think a team with the talent of Damwon would probably sink all the way to the bottom anyway, but they were a 9-9 team in spring, and they were the last playoff team that made it in. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that was due to Canyon. So he actually would have been my like overall player of the year because of that spring performance, weirdly enough. Not because of his Worlds performance, which obviously like Damwon was the team that was the most comfortable in the current meta, and obviously like the most skilled within that meta. So it makes sense that they won the World Championship, and it also makes sense that Canyon was so like highly recognized at that point. But his spring performance, in terms of players that I think get overlooked a lot, I actually weirdly want to highlight two, and they're both top laners. And I know people are going to disagree with me on at least one because he did not have the best world showing that I think he could have. And that one is 369. I think he's actually like a really remarkably skilled top laner. And I think that he doesn't get a lot of recognition on his own team because of the other names on his team, right? But I think he was one of their best performers, honestly, for a lot of their games. And I've watched him grow since, unfortunately, I don't have time to watch LDL as much as I would like, but since Demacia Cup, not this past year, but the year before, when he first kind of broke out, and then he turned 17, and they were like, okay, well, you're going immediately from being a trainee onto the lineup because you're this good. And then the other one is Zoom, which should come as no surprise to anyone. These are actually also two players I'm just really glad had some sort of like international stage where they could show off, because in the LPL, I think because it still doesn't have the same like prestige or history or recognition from the Western fan base as, say, the LCK does. A lot of these players that end up excelling in LPL seasons don't necessarily get the chance to prove themselves on the international stage. So Zoom and 369 were two players that I was really happy that did get to show off their skills at Worlds, despite the fact that Bin kind of took over the conversation later on because of how far Suning made it. Also, I think you could see the fact that Zoom is a better top laner than Bin in that series, by the way.
Yep, for sure.
Anyway.
I remember someone saying that, but Bin is GP versus Renekton, what do you do? I'm trying to find, if I could VOD review the pro view of that series and release it as public content. I don't know. Anyway, point is,
Zoom is good.
Zoom is good.
That's the point.
I think actually, I thought 369 had a lot of attention, so I'm kind of surprised to say that it was underrated. I do think he's very good though, and I've always been biggest Zoom fanboy. Like, if you've paid attention to my content throughout the years, you know that I think survive side top play is actually just really insane. You have to be really good at wave management. And I don't just mean, when people think survive side top play, they think, oh, you go down 50 CS and you're just a tank because you don't need items. But it's like, to actually take intelligent trades and manipulate the wave correctly on survive side as a top laner in the long lane is such a great and important skill in League of Legends. So if you're saying that he's a good survive side player because he's like gets smashed in lane and comes out and still has good engages, he's not a good survive side player. He's a good tank player. There's a difference in that. Anyway, like very few top laners throughout history have been able to carry through survive side, right? I would say that Zoom is definitely one of them. Cora 1 is definitely one of them. And then Odoamne. Those are the ones that I immediately think of. There are probably others. I think Someday has done it historically too. There are probably more that I'm forgetting right now, but just thinking about games that are carried from survive side top laners, just think about that and then realize how actually rare it is. Moving on, let's talk about most memorable players. So not necessarily best player, but the player that you loved watching the most this year, that you just tuned into all of his games, knew he's going to do some whack shit, and just really enjoyed it.
So I am actually going to pick, and this is definitely my like JDG bias. And people might think this is a surprising pick actually, because I've also said the statement that sometimes he doesn't have hands, and I stand by that statement on certain champions. But I'm actually gonna pick Lumao. I think he's like this player who oddly went from being like criminally underrated in terms of how smart he is about the game to like incredibly overrated based on that one Bard ult. So it's like he actually is somewhere in the middle where he's a very intelligent player. He is so like insanely good on certain champions. Like, I mean, we didn't get to see it this year, obviously, but like previously, he was known for his Fiddlesticks. And interviewing him, he's actually sad the post Fiddlesticks rework because he doesn't like it as much. But I'm gonna say Lumao because I feel like I really enjoyed watching him on this team. I really enjoyed what he did for their bot lane. I think that Loken was able to have a career year for himself because like thanks in large part, and he has said this too, like thanks in large part to Lumao. And it's always really weird when you're kind of evaluating supports because you don't know how much they do contribute to, like a lot of their contributions are not quantifiable, right? So you do have to kind of go on based on like what other people say or what you can infer from the way they move around the rift. But I think Lumao is an incredibly smart player. I always wanted to tune in to see what he and JDG were doing. And so he is my most memorable player of the year. Also, yeah, you still have that like insane Bard ult, I guess, that you can always point to.
Also the Bard ult, you know. I mean, he just runs it down a lot. I think that's something that you left out.
He does.
So for sure
he does. And like I don't want to see him on Pantheon again for a while, honestly.
That's part of the situation where it's like, okay.
But this isn't best, it's most memorable, right? So he is a memorable player.
For sure. No. I'm saying that's part of, you said that his intelligence was slightly overrated.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely, he's just constantly looking for fights. He doesn't care about XP. I think XP is just a number. So that's something to point out. Let's see. Levels are just a number, really. I think for me, I'm going to shout out another Academy player. This is going to annoy everyone, but I won't shout out anyone that was on my teams, but I will shout out Fnatic, who was on FlyQuest Academy, which I think was one of the most underrated Academy rosters this year in terms of talent relative to how they placed. So that's very unfortunate to them. They had Revenge, who's going to make LCS. Mash Big ball lane, and I think Big actually laned really well. Fnatic was the really green rookie relative to Triple, and obviously he had played on TSM Academy before, and he was known as kind of like the Zen One Trick. This guy showed up at Scouting Grounds at the end of last year, and he just kind of, everyone said, where did this Fnatic come from, you know? So I was disappointed he didn't have as much of a great career year, but he was someone who I always kind of liked watching for FlyQuest Academy games. He did a lot of things where he was always like kind of waiting in the brush around the river, around mid, just for you to walk in and contest the pixel, and then he would just pounce on you. So that's why his Baller Bear was very good. So he was an interesting player. I don't think that he was the greatest player in Academy by any means, but he was a player that I hope is going to still be on Academy teams next year, because I know that Fly Academy are moving forward with NXI. Okay, next topic, guys. One more kind of a fun fan favorite topic before we get to the last two that I think will be really interesting discussions. But who did you think throughout the year would win Worlds, and how did those evaluations kind of change?
So I thought it was going to be TES. Mm-hmm. And Damwon was like my second pick. And I think in terms of what changed with TES, or why they suddenly became, I guess, like they seemed to really struggle. Like, struggle isn't the right word, but like they definitely did not have the best handle on the metagame at Worlds as other teams did. And it didn't necessarily suit their playstyle as much as something like bringing back a super hard carry bottom lane would have. Because I actually thought, and you and I talked about this before the World Championship happened, I believe, but we were curious to see how the metagame would evolve and whether it would, whether teams would end up going back to kind of a more traditional like hard carry style bottom lane, in which case it would suit TES more than other LPL teams that were in attendance. And that obviously did not happen. Not that Karsa is like I mean, I know you have your own feelings towards Karsa, but I don't think is someone who is as comfortable in this meta as someone like a Kanavi or a Canyon or an SOFM. So, and that was like really, really apparent. I think the Fnatic TES series is also, like, speaking of just really interesting series to watch in terms of how it evolved. I recommend people go back and watch that series as well, because from a like drafting and adjustment standpoint, it was really, really interesting. And one of the things that they did is kind of gave up on trying to shove Karsa in that mold and let him be in lanes more and more of a facilitator, like he kind of prefers to do sometimes. And I think I'm not going to say like that's the sole reason that TES didn't make it, but I just think it came to a point in time where they did not suit the meta as well as other teams like Suning, like JDG actually, which JDG are an interesting team to look at in terms of them losing, because in a way it's almost more shocking than TES, only because of how that team is set up and their preferred playstyle and how they play around Kanavi. But in terms of like what changed for TES and why they didn't win Worlds, I do think it really just came down to the fact that there were equally / more talented teams that had a better read on the metagame at Worlds at the time. And if you look at the past Worlds that we've had, you can very clearly see that since, I mean, I feel like everyone draws this like clear demarcation line between 2017, which is still Korean dominance, and 2018, which isn't suddenly. But I think, and I've made this argument in that giant article I wrote about every single Worlds meta, you can still trace teams that were playing the metagame at that Worlds optimally to 2017, right? Like Samsung was a team that learned how to play through their bot side in a similar way that RNG did, because RNG scrimmed them. And that's why, I mean, there's this whole thing where RNG would have won Worlds if they hadn't blah, 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 which happens, I think, every time RNG is at Worlds. But anyway, you can still make the argument that the team that perfected the metagame at that time was still the best team. It just happened to come on the heels of like what people now see as like the final year of South Korea dominating everything. And TES were not that team this year. But bring it full circle on this very long rambling thing about Worlds metas, that is why I thought TES would succeed, and I think they didn't, just because they did not have as strong of a handle on the metagame as a team like Damwon, for whom this was like just remarkably perfect, and they were definitely the best team at Worlds in this meta.
Yeah, so TS is the last time that I predict a team that doesn't play the meta well to win. I'm never doing it again. I've already said that I think, like, I got kind of baited by JDG a little bit, in the sense that I knew that they played to the meta the best of any LPL team, and I knew that they had the ideal team structure for the meta, right? In terms of really successful top laner who's pretty strong, can consistently play roaming supports and bottom lanes to get prio, has a mid laner that's just going to push out the lane and back up his jungler consistently, and then a jungler who's playing for himself, playing fast clear. But even in spring, I was complaining, I think I did a show with you where I felt like Kanavi was not the best jungler in the world by any stretch of the imagination, just because of his decision making, and there were always so many opportunities for him to invade and deny the enemy jungler and become a stronger jungler that he wasn't taking. And it was just that in the context of the LPL, which had a terrible jungle meta, in my opinion, I still claim this way. So to talk a little bit more about the meta and disseminate some of the information, or distill it in a way that's very clear and concise, jungle is the only role in the game where you can consistently get a 2-level lead on a person from draft. No? Right? Like the other roles, the other guy has to screw up royally for that to happen. But if you have 2 prio lanes on one side and can fight for prio on the third side, then you should be able to control 3 quadrants of the map. And then the fact that there's no catch-up XP anymore, the fact that there's actually a high amount of XP on the jungle since the change between spring and summer, means that you can consistently get a 2-level lead if you have a favorable draft. So playing around the jungle and his opportunities and his pathing is just the best way to play the game right now. Or I shouldn't say right now, but during Worlds, I still think it's really good, because they didn't change XP, and you get 1 item as a jungler and the game's over if you're playing things like Amumu, etc. But the fact of the matter is that I was even just disappointed with how JDG, who were kind of the best team in terms of how they could play the meta, were playing jungle, just because a lot of LPL teams were still focused on, we're going to hard side trade and play for the lane, and a lot of times LPL players would just screw up their wave states so much and just play so far forward, because they were still playing kind of the IG style that ganks would happen that wouldn't be real like in other places. It's just not a real gank that should succeed. So you saw this most clearly in the play-in stage, where LGD showed up, and Peanut, who I had rated as kind of like the jungler who played to the meta the second best, because he played very selfishly, but he went top and he did a gank, and then Jose Adera took all of his camps on that side of the map, right? After his level 2 gank failed. It's like, okay, if LATAM jungles can punish these guys, this should be a huge wake-up call that TS is just not winning Worlds, right? Because I think Karsa was the worst defender of all of them. And this attitude that a lot of LPL teams have, which is that, it doesn't matter, the winning team decides the meta, is fine, and then they can still win domestically with that take, but I think a lot of it will come down to factors that they can't control, because if they're playing in a way that suits the meta, then they will have perfected it more than other teams, because they only play the one style. So if it swings in their favor, then LPL teams will win the tournament. But I should have known that LPL wasn't going to win Worlds when no one was playing jungle like Kenyon, right? So this is the last time that I predict a team that doesn't play meta to win anything. And they beat Fnatic too, but there are a lot of factors there, right? In terms of how Fnatic were playing the game, their proficiency in playing specifically for jungle, since it wasn't something that they have been doing consistently throughout summer even. So Yeah, that's my long rant on TES and the way that went. But I think if we go off of how Spring was and Jungle XP then I think it's very reasonable that they won MSC, right? That makes perfect sense to me. That based on Jungle XP, which had already been kind of buffed at that tournament, but people hadn't really adapted to it well. It makes a lot of sense for them to have won MSC in the context of that meta. Cool. So now that we have the boring topics out of the way, let's talk about a couple of things that are kind of end of the year, things that we're looking forward to next year. What do we think will happen? So the first one that people have been talking about a lot is the LCK back, right? There's this idea that the era of LCK dominance has returned because Damn won Worlds. So having your take on that is great. As someone who has long called themselves an LCK enthusiast, I would dare say expert or follower of OGN/LCK/Korean League of Legends. So
it's not coming back, guys. And by that I mean it's not. So like I think there's this weird desire, and I talked to Raz about this actually in an interview that most of it didn't even end up in the thing where I was interviewing him for, because it was for the giant like a World's Oral History thing that we did prior to the World Championship this year. But we were talking about IG actually. And if you're wondering why I'm going to use IG as an example, it's because when they won Worlds in 2018, afterwards, everyone automatically applied the lessons that they had learned from LCK dominance in, like, I would say, like, 2013 through 16-ish, and then applied that automatically to every single LPL team. So, you know, from top to bottom, suddenly every LPL team is the best. And this obviously went up against what you were seeing on the Rift when you watched LPL. So I feel like anyone who was coming in with that mindset and then started watching the LPL because they were like the best region, and I'm actually not saying that the LPL wasn't the best region at the time. I do think they were, but not because IG won Worlds, if that makes sense. I think like there was this weird thing that was butting heads with like, oh, top to bottom, every team in LPL has to be really, really good. And it's like, no, that actually is not the lesson that you should be taking. I think the lesson that people should be taking from this whole everything kind of opening up, arguably in 2017, it just so happened that another Korean team won. But definitely in 2018, is that the top teams from major regions, not including North America, are, depending on meta, can always go toe-to-toe with each other, right? So you saw from Damwon the same thing that you saw from, I would say, FPX at last year's Worlds, in that you have a team that perfected a playstyle, and they were the best team in that metagame. Like, I don't think it's arguable that like any team in the world was a better meta team than Damwon in summer and at Worlds. Like, I actually don't think there's an argument for any other team. And the lesson that I think we should be taking is not that LCK has sucked for the past 2 years and that now they're good. It's that you really, like, there was a time in League of Legends analysis, and again, I've written about this, so this is like a rant that I've always wanted to go on, I guess. There was a time in League of Legends analysis where literally all you had to do was look at the Korean teams and be like, okay, which Korean team is playing the best right now? That's going to be the team that wins. Because you did have such a discrepancy in terms of the understanding of the game between the South Korean teams in Champions tournaments and the rest of the world. That does not exist anymore, and it's never going to exist again. Like, I do not think we're going to have that kind of regional discrepancy ever again. So you need to actually look at games and you need to actually analyze teams. So I don't think the lesson to be taken from 2018 was that LCK is suddenly terrible. And I also don't think the lesson to be taken now is suddenly that LCK is the best. I do think Damwon are the best team in the world at this tournament.
Okay.
Just as I think FPX, I can't believe I'm saying this because you and I were like, I remember sitting with you and watching FPX lose to J Team, and we were both just like, yes, this seems very like FPX. At 2019 World. But like FPX were the best team at that time, right? Like they perfected their play style. And now everyone who wants to play like Doinb doesn't understand how Tian came to mid and would reset his wave all the time. But yeah, anyway, that's another random rant I have. But like, is LCK back? I don't think they'll ever be back the way that people want them to be back. And I think the way that people want them to be back is to just be able to blanket look at every single LCK team and be like, they're all the best. And that's not what's going to happen. You still need to look at the top teams, analyze their play style, and be like, okay, this team is the best because, and then list a reason.
Nice. So I also have had rants in the past on this subject. I think that one opinion that I've held for a long time is that if T1 didn't exist, there wouldn't have been the mythos of LCK or Korea or OGN or whatever you want to call it throughout the years as an unbeatable monster region. I think that for sure you had a lot of strong LCK or Korean teams other than T1, and probably we still would have seen a majority of tournaments won by LCK Korean teams, but I would say that T1, SKT T1, SKT T1K, SKT whatever they were at any given moment, always just, they introduced a lot of things over the course of the years. The use of Vision 2013 in terms of pick comps when pick comps were very viable. Just having very strong mid to top control in later years. A lot of it was the way that Vision worked or functioned in the past in terms of very fixed vision lines, having placements of pinks and greens that move over the course of the game, and then being able to use picks in your own jungle for that, and just create situations for effective comeback team fights off of that. Were always things that I think got attributed to Korean teams as a whole as like the Korean style, when you had a lot of Korean teams playing differently. And I think that so it's just really interesting the existence of T1 as a team. And I don't want to take away a lot from other players on the team because there have been good players. There's been a good understanding of the game. But Faker is just such a unique and interesting talent. And seeing him not at the top of his game anymore is really sad in a way, because I feel like he's almost a one-in-a-lifetime talent that we'll never see again in this game in terms of how effective he was. And there are a lot of reasons for this. People would say that it's harder to be in a solo carry position now, but even without that context, like he found ways to kind of adapt his gameplay to, I think you wrote articles about how he became the jungler effectively for the team when he had to play with
for Blank.
a lot of rookie junglers, right? He always found ways to adapt how he was playing the game intelligently. And I think Dopa released this video talking about why Faker was so great recently. And a lot of this stuff was stuff that I was already talking about in 2016 in terms of his use of fake pressure, fake pressure, whatever. But, and so it was just kind of like, to me, it was disappointing that this is only just now a conversation, right? I remember what you said. There's like things Faker does, right? Which was a big expression in the past. That for me, it was just people were just wrong about things Faker does, or the things that Faker does that actually made him impressive. So I think I remember I wrote an article in 2016 that was like how to play mid lane in 2016. That was just talking about contrasting the idea of like the solo kills, because I think there was one game in that final where Crown solo killed Faker, even though it's SKT1 but just the pressure that he had on the map relative to Crown, and a lot of those movements, and a lot of it focused on, you know, the Raptor camp at the time, which gave oracles cleared vision.
Those are the good days.
Yeah, so it was just so that article is probably not super applicable to a lot of stuff now, but just in general, like I think if Faker didn't exist, we wouldn't have talked about the Korean region as just unbeatable for so long. And then so for me now, it's in the past, over the course of time, we've had a best team in the world from Europe, China, and Korea at different given moments, right? I would say spring, probably TS was the best team in the world, right, this year. FPX won Worlds, but in spring, G2 were for sure the best team in the world. And then, like, we've had Damwon win this Worlds. I think that's just really exciting. And what you said is just like, you have to understand the meta, and you have to understand the teams best suited to it. And if ever there's an LPL team that plays really well to the meta, they're probably going to win Worlds. That doesn't make LPL the best region, but that just means that they have kind of perfected each individual LPL team has perfected kind of their individual style. The other rant that I like to go on is about the war change that occurred in 2018.
Crackers night!
Which, for me, it's like you're not nerfing the Korean playstyle, you're nerfing like SKT, but also, even with some of those changes in place, RNG was still winning, right? Leading up to MSI, there were changes that were put into place that affected Vision before RNG won the tournament. So I think that it's kind of disingenuous to say that, well, jungles, I think one argument I've heard is that SKT are good, or that Korea is good again because jungle is important. And arguably, they had the best team in the world at playing around jungle this year. And historically, they've had some really, really good teams at playing around jungle. But that isn't like a universal thing that every Korean team has done either. So, anyway.
You know what a fun hypothetical is for me now that I'm thinking about it?
Sure.
What happens to SKT in 2015 if there's no Cinderhulk?
If there's no Cinderhulk?
Yeah. Because that, like, single-handedly saved Bengi's playstyle at the time.
Probably.
Like, not single-handedly, but like,
Emily, the first time
he was,
Emily
like,
on
big
stage.
struggle before that. I'm just saying.
The first time Italy on stage, though. No, it's
I'm not trying to dunk on Bengi. I've actually grown to love Bengi, where previously I was just like, no. But yeah, like that's always a fun hypothetical for me too. It's like, what happens if Cinderhulk doesn't go through? Not just for Bengi, but for two very specific junglers that were learning how to play the position at the time in Ambition and Score.
It's such an interesting conversation. 2015 is the weirdest year in League of Legends history, in my opinion.
It's so fucking weird for like so many reasons.
There's so many things that happened. I think.
Oh god, it was a mess. It was a mess.
In 5 years from now, we'll probably have a really difficult time deciding whether 2020 or 2015 is weirder. Honestly. But right now I feel like 2015 is just weirder. Even though 2020 has like all those asterisks with online play, MSI not happening, teams losing trajectory because of COVID, the jungle meta so drastically changing halfway through the year. Even though there are all those asterisks this year, there's so much stuff to talk about 2015. I mean, 2015 effectively began with rumors about Rookie and Kakao being
being locked in a basement, yes.
Or coal mines specifically. Like they had like images of them wearing like coal miner gear and stuff like that because they were thinking that they were being held hostage by LPL teams somewhere. Like it was that absurd and ridiculous. Like that year was so strange, man. I don't know.
Oh god.
But that's one year where legitimately, if you talk to any LPL player who competed in 2015. After EDG won MSI, they thought that it was just over, right? When we talk about narratives impacting teams, that's one of the biggest examples. Narratives from journalists and content creators, and especially casters, always are going to affect players. Like, players are human. right? So even if they know the game better and they understand things, and a lot of players have talked about it now, where it's like if people are really bagging on a teammate, then they won't necessarily look at the game as introspectively. They just feel like they're losing. They don't understand why. It's like, get rid of this guy, right? I think 2015, EDG won MSI, and everyone on Weibo was really celebrating it. Zatai said, I was thinking about retiring, but if EDG can win MSI, then I can do it, I can win Worlds. Like, LPL is the best region, and then that's when the LPL best region narrative I saw it for the first time, right? People decided that LPL was the best region in the world because EDG won MSI, which is just absurd.
Which again is like, so like to come full circle, that's applying the same logic that we used for South Korean teams to one win.
So it's a very, like, I think a lot of narratives, and this is why the show titled Narrative Wake existed, a lot of narratives are easy to rely on, right? Because it's easy to not think too much and to just say, oh, well, this, if this, then this. Hooray. And it's easy to encapsulate an idea and throw it out there. Because if you talk about nuances, then a lot of times people just don't care. They don't want to listen to the entire explanation. They don't want to think about it. They just want like an easy thing that they can apply. And I think that that's okay in a lot of such situations, but historically it's led to some weird stuff. So LPL players were actually just buying into this idea that LPL teams were the best teams in the world, and they have actually said that impacted the preparation that they had for that World Championship. And if you, I didn't talk about this a lot at the time. I did write an article about it, and I remember it getting kind of flamed, but LPL practice in general was just really poor.
It was so bad.
And then on top of that, if you think about 2015 now, that was like the biggest aberration of LPL team performance in the history of League of Legends, wasn't it? Because they've always consistently been like one of the top 2 performing regions.
Yeah.
And so the fact that was the year where only one team got out of groups and then they lost in quarters, it's also funny because you think about it in the context of the LMS doing well. LMS has not done as well since that World Championship either, and it's like that's because LPL completely bombed. So someone else had to win, right? Like, it's really sad to think of it in this reductionist way, but a lot of the things that happened in 2015 make a lot of sense. If you're thinking about, and then of course the Juggernaut patch change before Worlds, like all that stuff. 2015 was such a weird year. So all this is to say that SKT were definitely the best team in the world that year. Like, don't get me wrong. But their domestic competition was so bad because of a lot of the exodus, and then LPL teams effectively didn't practice. Like, there were streams of their scrims at the time, I remember, where Wayless was actually just intentionally feeding. Like, actually openly saying he was intentionally feeding. And then it was like, yes, SKT is clearly the best team in the world, but this is such a weird tournament. But even
this is also a narrative, but like you have 2 years later that like meeting of coaches at Rift Rivals where they're like, what if we don't troll each other's scripts?
Pretty much.
And like, I'm not gonna say that was like the end all be all like change, but I do think that it had to come to a head at some point, and when that happened, it made a huge difference.
But it's like also applying that, right? It is actually impressive when you think about it a bit, because SKT is such a singular team, and the organization and Faker is such a singular player, that even though everything else in that year has a gigantic asterisk and you can't really question it, they kept their shit together. Like, that's so crazy, you know? Like, that's actually insane. So that's the argument that you can make if you want to advocate for SKT 2015 being the best roster in the history of League of Legends, because I know some people do, and I don't personally, but thinking about all the context and the fact that, oh my god, yes, everyone was trolling, but they kept their shit together is actually pretty impressive. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else to say on is LCK back topic other than actually watch the games and decide for yourself, guys. That's pretty much the TLDR. All right, so next topic, and this is the last one before we have the Emily Rand celebration, is the fact that LCS has had very significant budget cuts related to NBA money. Good, low-key, actually just good for the region.
I think it'll end up being good if teams... One of the things I know you've addressed publicly that I want to like back up 100% is that whenever people compare taking a player from like not even LDL, I guess, yeah, but also LDL players have been included in this. But like taking a player from quote unquote solo queue and then starting them on an LPL roster, starting them on an LCK roster, that actually rarely happens, guys. Like these players are on trainee teams, so even if the team isn't announcing fully, like, yes, we have XYZ player as a trainee, and NA lacks that same kind of infrastructure, but there is also this weird misconception that players are suddenly like, you're super high in Korean solo queue, so we're gonna like pluck you and you're starting now and you're amazing. And that doesn't actually typically happen. Typically, those players are already trainees. So I want to make that clear before I start talking about starting players in NA. I think it is actually a good thing. I think the only way it will backfire, which is still highly probable, is if teams after one bad, we don't have a split, but like after, a certain amount of losses or whatever, are like, okay, this experiment failed. We're done here. We're going to go back to picking, no names and end up going for like a, 6th, 5th place finish. And previously, those same players would not have had an opportunity because of the way people were looking at either spending a ton of money to bring in other players or just using North American talent that's already been like proven to an extent, and so exactly where they are, right? Like you kind of know where they stand, and that is reliable enough that you're going to keep them on the roster. And so I think it could be really good. I just like have this sinking feeling that after like a certain amount of losses, some of these teams are going to go back and just try to find something else. And if there is no other way to actually get players at some point, you do need to give the players this experience, right? Because unfortunately, again, like, and you can speak to this way better than I can, but you get to the point where you have to promote them because unfortunately the bridge between amateur and LCS still doesn't really exist in any sort of crossable capacity. And you eventually have to give the players that kind of experience. And I don't know, like I'm cautiously optimistic, but I also just see a world where everyone dunks on these players because whatever. And like, I know people are already, I was watching Hotline League and people were already being like, well, can Palafox lane against Perks? And it's like, well, that's kind of beside the point to some extent if you individually go into like X player versus Y player in a matchup without knowing draft and how the team is playing, etc. But it's also like if people are already having that discussion, I can't even imagine what it's going to be like once LCS actually starts.
First of all, Palafox is good. I think anyone I was someone who was like really, really kind of low down on the North American Worlds performance, so I had a lot of that was based on just fundamental laning mistakes that I saw teams making. And I've talked a lot about this at length so I won't bore people too much, but there's a lot of mistakes being made that are not being made globally or at an international level, and from that lens, Palafox is really good, actually. Like, his laning is decent. I think it definitely stands up. So I don't think that, and I know that there's been a lot of criticism of players who debut in LCS and their ability to lane, but I don't think Palafox is someone that you worry specifically about that point on. So it's an interesting conversation for sure. I think just in general, people's ability to assess talent isn't insane. But there's also just a gap between every level. I mean, I do think there's a wide variety of scouting that's done. And I think this was the most rigorous... Being part of 100 Thieves roster building process for 2021 was probably the most rigorous scouting experience that I've seen or heard of in general. So that was very cool for me from that perspective. But I have also heard of a lot of, we've heard this guy's good and our CEO likes him and thinks he's really sick and he did well in Europe, so let's sign him. You know, I've seen a lot of stuff like that as well. So there's a wide range of scouting and no team is different and no team is the same, but talent assessment isn't the most insane everywhere, right? So a lot of times the only way that people get a feeling for how good a player is if they see them in LCS. Just having the LCS experience in general, since talent assessment is poor, is more likely to get a player in the conversation than otherwise. So it can be a net positive for them. I remember talking to Niles at SG, and I asked him, because he was a player that I had reached out to him before, and we just had Fake God at 100 Thieves Academy, and I think Fake God is really good. So there's there's that, but he was someone I always kind of kept tabs on. And the big thing there was just, I asked him, and he said, well, a lot of teams thought they wanted a top laner with more experience. So it was like, in Academy. They want a top laner with more experience in Academy. Okay, cool. But there's just, I think it's just and obviously I'm not shitting on everyone's roster plans, but a lot of criticisms that people levy against Academy do make sense, right? It has sort of become an extended bench for LCS teams, and some teams use that for a goal well, but I generally think the purpose of Academy from the very beginning was to develop talent. And so for me, that is an extremely problematic situation. And a big thing, as you said, is just the trainee systems and all those things that already exist in other regions that we haven't made a genuine effort to copy or realistically emulate. And I'm not saying we should copy everything that every region does, because I think, for example, copying gaming houses was a complete and utter disaster, personally. But I do think that this idea that talent can come straight from solo queue is a flat-out lie, which you already touched on, and be really, really competent at the highest level of gameplay in the region is a flat-out lie, especially if your solo queue is fucking garbage, which ours is. So there's just a lot of things that players need to learn or understand, and laning is definitely one of them, right? It's up there. I think ProView is a really good tool, so it's like ProView was gone this year. But that's a really big thing, is that if we haven't made a genuine effort to develop talent in NA for so many years, that now we're just looking at the gap between like existing veteran LCS pros and the next generation, we're thinking this is just so hard to overcome, right? It's difficult.
Yeah.
But
bridge, like I said, the bridge is just not there. Like, it doesn't exist.
We have to do it. If we want to ever complete internationally, it has to be done, right? Who were the two of the best performers at Worlds from NA this year? It was Spica and Tactical, right? I think that's kind of unarguable. And it's because a lot of work has gone into those players. And it's also because, and obviously a lot of that is self-motivated from them. I think they're both like really, really driven players. So I'm not saying that their coaching staff is like 1v9ing their development or anything like that. But I definitely think that like part of the reason is because you are constantly looking at different things. And this isn't to shit on veterans, because I think a lot of coaching in NA hasn't really helped convince veterans to look at the game in different ways, right? So, but I do think that a lot of the newer players are more willing to do it just from the get-go, to think about the game differently, to do all sorts of different things. And you see this in every single region, right? You see this in every single region. It's not just an NA problem with veterans not changing kind of the way that they've always known how to win. Like Doinby will always play the way Doinby plays. He's not going to change at this point. It just so happened that last year the way Doinby plays was really good, you know?
And he had a jungler that could work really well with
and Doinby's way of playing is always going to require a really mechanically strong jungler, right?
Yes.
So I think that we need to kind of start cycling these players up. And I'm not the biggest fan of the way Golden Gardens is doing it because I think that a lot of those players will not look great, and I don't think the community will be super forgiving of them, or not look great initially, I should say, just because they do have a lot to learn. And I don't think the community will be extremely forgiving at first. So I think that that'll be rough. So like having a system that will help them learn more before just like throwing them in the fire is probably better. I say this from the experience of having multiple players who have been in that situation, like pure rookies from academy to LCS in the same year. And it has been rough, you know? There's a lot of stuff that needs to be learned, win conditions laning, all sorts of stuff. But I think that we do start to need to do this. And I did a lot of research in terms of promotion. A lot of sports use proactive promotion, guys, because they know injuries are going to happen. They know they're going to have to bench a player for some reason. And for us, like, injuries are less common, though I've personally been on a team that's gotten really screwed over by injury. It's not as common in esports, but things like meta changes are kind of an equivalent way for a player to kind of get phased out a bit. So having proactive promotion so that a player is already within a system that he recognizes a situation before, like he's played some LCS scrims before or anything like that, is really, really good for his ability to perform if he ever needs to be called up for any reason later on. So giving him experience early on, a lot of people, I think the perception is that this punishes the LCS player, but it's good for the team in general. Like, I don't understand how a lot of NA teams can be so org focused in terms of branding and buyouts and the revenue that they can get from that, but not org focused in the sense that we need to make sure we have a generation of bench players that can compete. So it's a really weird system, for sure. So I think it can low-key be really good, but I think a lot of it will depend on how the narrative around these players is shaped. So it's going to depend on people like us, people like casters, people like everyone. So I think some of my mistake in talking about the impact of narrative on roster building before was to call out Redditors, but I think people like content creators and casters have way more power and way more responsibility in that sense to tell the true story, right? Because fans will use a lot of content creators that they like as guides in that sense. So I think that that's kind of my feeling on it, is that it is forcing, like the budget cuts are forcing us to make sure we have a generation of players prepared. The same thing happened in the EU, guys. Like, everyone looks at Mad Lions as, holy shit, these guys are five-head, but all the team and all of the veterans that retired, right? But a lot of teams just lost money and couldn't pay for a ridiculous amount of players. Like, why do you think Astralis' roster exists like this year? It's, they can't pay for the same stars that they have in the past. They can't pay as much the salary, so they're forced to take risks on younger players. And that's because we've been overspending in League. It is a bubble, for sure. So I think it's low-key good because it'll force us to address a problem that we haven't.
I keep thinking of, I'm not going to bring up who the players were, but I keep thinking of that this conversation that you had with another coach, who I also won't name just for like privacy reasons, but because I shadowed your team at Scouting Grounds last year, and we had a conversation about a few players and how like overly aggressive they were, and they would ignore a lot of like really obvious and more efficient methods of laning to instead trade really, really, really aggressively. And there arose the argument of, do we teach these players that this is unequivocally bad? Like, do we teach them, you absolutely need to play safe, reset here, et cetera, or do we kind of like allow them to go ham and learn from their mistakes that way, so that being aggressive and proactive, even when it is a risk, is not unequivocally seen as a bad thing from this very early stage in their development. And additionally, like I know Mark Z did a video on this, right? Mm-hmm. With the TSM Engage, where he talked about how Spica actually has the right idea in that turret dive. He's going forward, and literally all of the veteran players on the team just back off. Mm-hmm. And if everyone makes the decision to go forward, like if that's an LPL team, you're going in. Like LPL teams will do actually insanely terrible turret dives a lot of the time because the wave won't be in the right spot, or it's just not optimal to do that because they forgot to track the enemy jungler or whatever. But they will all go in together, and there are several situations. Obviously, I think the Lilia sleep is also another one that everyone's going to point out, but I think the turret dive is a better example because I think TSM could have followed up on that a lot easier. Anyway, I think that's also an interesting thing to point out in NA talent development that I've seen as an outsider, even not even as a coach.
Yep, I think it's definitely an interesting conversation to have, and I spent a lot of the off-season talking just talking about this topic, particularly in relation to getting younger players experience, because it's something that has been difficult for me to watch as someone who cares a lot about these guys, right? I'm not even going to argue that I don't have some bias in this regard, right? So I think that's just probably might talk a little bit more about it as time goes on, because I fully think that it should be more of a conversation in terms of how best do we develop players in NA or in general. So I think that's probably we'll see more about that from me. All right, so that kind of winds down our big topics here. I just wanted to, it's been a really interesting year, so just wanted to highlight some of the questions or ideas that came out of it, even with the COVID situation. But I do think there's something really exciting to talk about, which is that Emily Rand is League of Legends Esports Journalist of the Year, as I've already said multiple times. But I think it's really exciting for me. The first time I met Emily, she was writing for Paravine. It was 2015?
Yeah, it was 2015.
Yeah, 2015, early on. And she was covering Brazilian League of Legends. And I remember her and this guy named Chris Cuenco were trying to cast it. So actually my first experience with Emily Rand was as a caster. So
it's cursed. It's so cursed. Thank God those mods don't exist.
Because I remember part of the reason I was talking to her is because I was thinking, okay, I've done this LPL English broadcast thing for a while, for the better part of 2014. So maybe I can help them out with their CB LOL stuff. If I find these videos, maybe I include a clip. Who knows if they're out there? I will.
As far as I know, they aren't, because we had to take them down. Because full disclosure, as soon as we started casting, there was someone in our chat being like, "You cannot do this," and we were like, "Okay," and they were like, "Take the stream down," and we were like, "Okay," and then we did, and then we deleted the VOD. But if you find it, let me know, because that'd be hilarious. I would love to listen to my terrible casting from 2015.
There you go. Over the course of that year, though, I began to kind of get a sense of Emily as someone who I could have a conversation with in which neither of us actually acknowledged each other. Because she would just talk about whatever was going on in CB LOL while I talked about LPL. And then we weren't acknowledging each other very much, but we were just taking turns going on rants. And I feel like that's basically what Making the Rounds is still today. Just us taking turns going on rants. So I think that's just the main core of our relationship. But the thing that always struck me about Emily, I think more than a lot of other people in the scene, is how good of a writer she is. Like, I think that this is something that you think about good storytellers, you think about good interviewers, people have good rapport with teams or individuals, but Emily's writing in and of itself is just so good. The way that she describes situations and effectively emotionally manipulates you when you're reading what she has to say is pretty insane. Like, I would say, obviously, Fionn is a really good storyteller, right? He tells stories in a way that you're sitting around a campfire with friends and they're telling you about this really cool thing that happened. They make you laugh. You have a good time. But Emily makes you fucking cry, guys. Like, this is the big thing. She'll tell, like, these very personal stories about her experiences at OGN that make you want to really have a conversation with the players that she talks to. And she'll describe the feeling of being there and actually make you feel like you're there. And this is something that I talk about with good cinema, is that good cinema is something that really kind of conveys the experience, because you have like the visual effects, the auditory effects, like all of these things that can immerse you. But Emily accomplishes that with words. So I think that that's something that makes her Journalist of the Year a really long time coming. It's something that I definitely can't do. So big congratulations to Emily as my sort of send off there. Can you give us any teasers or anything like that about what you're planning to do after ESPN?
I mean, I think so. Looking at a lot of varying points in my career, the last time I lost my job, which was when we were both at Yahoo, actually, which was honestly, like, of all places I've worked, the coolest experience in terms of being on an esports vertical.
We'll just
because we were just kind of allowed to do.
And Travis will retweet it. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh no, he will absolutely. I already told him this, but yeah, he will just be like, look, Yahoo Esports still lives. But yeah, at that point in time, I don't think I was as, like, quote unquote, unfortunately, like, well known. I'm actually really bad at branding. I'm really bad at using social media for that purpose as well, just because my mental isn't always that good. So being on social media a lot is just really bad for me. You can call me weak-minded or whatever you want right here. Also, sorry for the dog howling in the background. I think at that time in my life, I was really concerned with what I was going to do. And when I ended up freelancing for, I mean, ESPN more than any other places, but also like Slingshot, VP, it was one of those, like, okay, I'm going to be living paycheck to paycheck, and this is really, really scary. And at the very least, I think now, not just because I won the award, but that also helps. I think I do have a lot more, I guess, visibility where it matters in terms of people reaching out, looking for a writer or some sort of broadcast analyst or something. So that in and of itself, I think, puts me in a slightly better position going forward when my contract runs out. I also think that if ESPN taught me anything over the past few years, it's been that I can branch out within reason. Like, this past year, so basically, like, keeping track of all the content I did, not even including stuff I did at Worlds, I looked at it before World started, and I was like, okay, if I don't produce anything for the rest of the year, which obviously I did not think was going to be the case at the time, but if I don't produce anything for the rest of the year, I'm already averaging like 1.5 things for everything I've done. It taught me that I could branch out and do a lot of things that I didn't think I could do, like be fun, and try to, like, loosen up a bit, which I think was valuable. Not that I'm always going to be like that, but and now I can go back to being a specialist, which is cool. So it's looking like I'm going to be probably doing the freelance thing, but in a much better position than where I was previously, and also returning to League of Legends specifically, because I actually think this year's probably, just because I was unable to focus on it as much, probably my worst year in terms of League of Legends analysis. Since I started writing about it, actually, in 2014. But yeah, I think going forward, I am very fortunate and lucky to have a lot of options. So that'll be cool. I don't think everyone's going to be accepting, like, rambling big features about Score's effect on my life, but that is something that's in the works, because I interviewed him last year at Worlds and it never saw the light of the day yet. So look forward to that wherever it gets posted. But yeah, no, it's not looking as bad as I thought it would be. I was really nervous at first, but now just like, okay, cool. Like I think I'll have enough options that I won't have to worry about living paycheck to paycheck, which is honestly a luxury.
All right. Well, I am glad to hear that you will be continuing to produce content in the future. I know a lot of your devoted fans were concerned. So I think.
I mean, yeah, I think the last thing I wrote was about a K-pop concert, which was a very weird experience, by the way. But yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
So yeah, this has been pretty much making the rounds unemployed edition. So I don't have any details on my situation for those of you who care, even though I'm not esports journalist of the world to release yet, but. Yes, I'm still saying esports journalist of the world, the English-speaking world. I'm American. I can be very. I can think that my country is the only one that exists. That's what the last 4 years have taught me. Anyway, I mean, everyone knows what I'm talking about, so I don't have to go into the details. So this has been a fun one. Hoping that I can do some more stuff with you. Maybe we'll talk about All-Stars or something when it comes out. Just do more making the round stuff while we're talking about some goings-on. Would be cool to do some, I don't know, everyone loves lists. Maybe some power rankings or something. Who knows?
No, please. Yes. I just got ESPN.
We'll come up with a. I
was thinking to myself, at least I don't have to do power.
We'll come up with a creative spin on it. You know. We'll do
for those that don't know me, because I think people think I love to do power rankings and that I think they're like awesome or something.
Ignore her.
Hate
She DMs me every week and says, I'm so excited for ESPN power rankings. Kelsey, I can't wait until they come out. I'm so excited. Oh, every time. So don't listen to her. She's lying, obviously. Anyway. Thanks, guys. Really happy to have had the occasion to do this episode for obvious reasons. So, yeah, we'll be in touch.